Helen Mercer learned too late why Caleb Warren kept asking about the water rights beside her farm. 14 luxury homes were already rising, but Caleb had not completed the permanent supply their buyers would need. A utility connection was possible, yet it cost far more than purchasing Helen's decades-old irrigation rights. His first offer was generous, his second could change her life, and his third could erase every debt. Helen refused them all because losing that water could endanger her farm in the next severe drought. Caleb assumed she would surrender before occupancy approval became urgent, insisting everyone eventually had a price. Then the approval stalled, exposing the cost of building around a signature he had never secured. Helen Mercer had nothing against new neighbors. When Caleb Warren bought the hillside beside her farm, she knew development was coming. His company had approval for 14 luxury homes, and the preliminary plans showed how the project expected to obtain water. There was already a workable option. A regional utility main ran several miles away, and Caleb's engineers had identified an extension route capable of serving the development once the additional infrastructure, approvals, and connection work were completed. It wasn't cheap, but it meant Caleb wasn't building 14 houses with no possible water source. He was building while looking for a cheaper one, although Helen didn't know that yet. For months, she watched the hillside change. Bulldozers cut the development road. Concrete trucks climbed the slope. Foundations became framed houses, then stone exteriors and oversized windows overlooking the valley. Caleb kept construction moving quickly while Helen kept farming. His project was his business, and her fields were hers. Then Caleb started asking about her water. He found Helen one afternoon clearing debris from an irrigation gate. "How much water do you normally run through here?" he asked. Helen looked up. "Depends on the month. Summer average. Why?" "Just curious." Helen smiled. Developers aren't usually curious about irrigation. Caleb looked toward the ditch. "Your water rights are pretty old, aren't they?" That made her stop. "You've been researching them. I've been researching supply options." "For your houses?" Caleb hesitated. "Among other things." 2 days later, he arrived at Helen's kitchen with a folder. Inside was a formal offer to purchase part of her agricultural water allocation. The price was substantial. Helen read the first page. "I thought your development already had a water plan." "It does." "Then why do you need mine?" Caleb leaned back. "The utility extension is expensive. Your rights are closer, and if we can complete an approved transfer, it gives us a better long-term solution." Helen finally understood. Caleb wasn't standing there because his 14 homes had absolutely no path to permanent water. He was standing there because the path already available to him would cost far more than he wanted to spend. "And you've already started building based on the assumption I'd sell." "We're still completing the final supply arrangements." "That's not an answer." Caleb didn't respond. He turned to the page showing how much water he wanted. Helen recognized the amount immediately. It was significant. "Permanent transfer. That's what we're proposing." She closed the folder. Caleb smiled. "It's a strong offer. I haven't said the water is for sale. You haven't seen the final number." Helen looked through the window toward 14 houses rising above her fields. Caleb had a viable way to supply them, but somewhere along the way he'd apparently decided Helen's water would be easier and cheaper. Before she sold him a single share, she needed to know what losing it would do to her farm. Because Caleb's biggest gamble wasn't building 14 homes without any possible source of water. It was building them while assuming Helen would eventually let him replace the expensive solution with hers. The next morning, Helen walked the farm with Caleb's offer folded inside her jacket pocket. She wanted to see what the number on his paper meant on the ground. Water reached the upper field first. From there, Helen directed it through a network of irrigation ditches that served the lower acreage in rotation. During spring, she had flexibility, but by late summer, she didn't. Every portion of her allocation had a job. Helen opened one gate and watched water spread slowly between rows of crops. Then she checked the pasture troughs farther down. Caleb had described what he wanted as part of her water rights. Standing there, it didn't feel like a part. It felt like weeks of irrigation. That afternoon, Caleb returned. This time, Helen had questions. "How much are you asking me to transfer permanently?" He opened his folder and showed her the figure again. Helen had already compared it with her records. That's nearly what I depend on during the driest part of summer. You don't use the full allocation every year. Some years I don't, exactly. Helen shook her head. That's like saying, I don't need my roof because it didn't rain yesterday. Caleb smiled. You'd still have water. How much? Enough to operate. According to who? He hesitated. Our consultant looked at historical use. Your consultant doesn't run this farm. Caleb tried another approach. You could become more efficient. Helen stared at him. Meaning? Drip systems, better storage, different irrigation scheduling. All things I'd pay for after selling you the water that currently makes those upgrades unnecessary. I'm offering enough money to cover improvements. And if we get 3 dry summers? Caleb didn't answer immediately. That silence mattered more than his projections. Helen had farmed long enough to understand that water wasn't most valuable in an average year. It was most valuable when there wasn't enough. That evening, she pulled 10 years of farm records. She compared irrigation schedules, dry season usage, crop acreage, and the years when her allocation had been stretched hardest. Caleb's requested amount looked manageable in a wet year. In a dry one, it could force choices. Which field wouldn't get irrigated? How much acreage would she stop planting? Would she reduce livestock? Would she eventually have to change the entire operation? The check Caleb was offering suddenly looked different. It wasn't payment for something Helen didn't need. It was payment for accepting future risk so his 14 houses wouldn't have to. Before bed, Helen called a water rights attorney recommended by another farmer. I've been offered a lot of money for part of my allocation, she explained. Temporary lease or permanent transfer? Permanent. There was a short pause. Then don't evaluate it based only on what you used last year. Helen looked toward Caleb's illuminated construction site on the hillside. What should I evaluate? What your farm may need 20 years from now. The attorney also explained that a recorded agricultural right was not merely water passing through a ditch on a particular afternoon. It carried priority, conditions, and a long history of beneficial use, and any proposed change in ownership or purpose would still have to follow the applicable review process. Caleb could offer money, but he could not convert Helen's allocation into residential supply through a private promise alone. Helen would first have to agree, then the proposed transfer would have to be examined. That made the decision even clearer. This was not a temporary favor she could reverse after one season. It was a permanent change whose consequences could outlast both of them. Helen glanced at the offer on her table. For the first time, the price wasn't the number that concerned her. It was how much of her farm's future Caleb expected that number to buy. 3 days later, Helen sat across from attorney Laura Bennett with Caleb's proposal between them. Laura read the transfer language before looking at the price. He's not asking to lease this for a few years. I noticed. This is intended to be permanent. Helen nodded. If I sell it, can I buy the water back later? You could try. That doesn't mean it would be available or affordable. Laura turned to Helen's irrigation records. How dependent is the farm on this amount? In normal years, I could probably manage with less. And in a bad year? That's what worries me. Laura leaned back. Then that's the year you should be planning around. They spent the next hour going through Helen's records. The conclusion wasn't dramatic. Selling wouldn't destroy the farm the next morning. Her fields wouldn't suddenly turn brown, and her livestock wouldn't immediately go without water. That almost made Caleb's offer more tempting, but permanent loss worked differently. During a wet season, Helen might barely notice it. During consecutive dry years, she could be forced to reduce irrigated acreage, change what she planted, or cut back other parts of the operation. The money Caleb offered was immediate, while the risk Helen would keep was permanent. Can he take these rights if I refuse to sell? Helen asked. Not simply because his development needs them. What if he's already built the houses? Laura looked at her. Building first doesn't turn your property right into his. Helen remembered that sentence. Caleb called that evening. Talk to someone? And? I'm not selling. Silence followed, then Caleb laughed softly. You haven't even negotiated. I'm not negotiating the price. Everyone negotiates the price. Helen looked through her kitchen window toward the hillside. 14 houses stood in various stages of completion, and Caleb had millions invested up there. I'm telling you the water isn't for sale. You'd still have plenty. Maybe in an average year. Helen, the offer would pay off whatever debt you have on that farm. I know. You could replace equipment, upgrade irrigation, put money away. I know that too. Then what exactly is the problem? Helen paused. A dry year. Caleb didn't respond. She continued. Your numbers work because you're treating the years when I don't use every bit of my allocation as proof that I don't need it. That's what historical use shows. No, it shows that weather changes. Caleb's voice hardened slightly. I can increase the offer. That won't make it rain. Another silence followed. Then he said, think about it. I already have. He ended the call. The next morning, Helen drove past the development entrance on her way into town. For the first time, she noticed a large sales banner attached to the stone wall. Luxury homes coming soon. Below it were architectural renderings of landscaped yards, green lawns, and 14 finished houses overlooking the valley. Helen slowed. Caleb hadn't approached her while deciding whether to build. He had approached her after the houses were already rising, and that changed the meaning of every offer he'd made. He wasn't asking whether Helen wanted to participate in his development. He had already built the development around the assumption that eventually she would say yes. A week after Helen refused the first offer, Caleb drove onto her farm without calling. Helen found him near the equipment shed carrying another folder. Above them, construction had moved quickly. 3 homes had finished stone exteriors, landscaping crews were working around 2 more, and a large sales sign now stood at the development entrance. You've been avoiding my calls, Caleb said. I answered your question. You answered the first offer. No, I answered the sale. Caleb opened the folder. I increased the number. Helen didn't take it. That doesn't change what you're buying. She looked toward the hillside. How many homes have buyers? Caleb hesitated. Several. Under contract? We have reservations and conditional purchase agreements. Financial on what? Normal completion requirements. Helen waited. Caleb finally added, final inspections, utility completion, occupancy approval, the usual things, including water. Laura later confirmed that the reservations and conditional purchase agreements did not give any buyer a present right to occupy a house or demand water from Helen. The buyers could face delays, revised closing dates, or whatever remedies their agreements provided, but Helen had never contracted with them and had never represented that her farm would serve the development. Keeping that distinction clear mattered because it prevented Caleb's construction schedule from being mistaken for a legal claim against property he did not own. Now Helen understood why he was back. So nobody is closed yet. No. But you're taking deposits while the permanent water arrangement is still being finalized. Caleb's expression hardened. We have a viable supply path. The utility extension. Among other options. Then use it. It's expensive. Helen almost laughed. So, we're back to my water. Caleb stepped closer. The development doesn't need your rights because they're magical, Helen. They make the project more efficient, cheaper. More efficient, cheaper. He didn't correct her again. Caleb had never been foolish enough to build 14 luxury homes with no possible water source. His engineers had identified the regional utility extension before construction advanced this far, but he'd made a different gamble. He had kept building while trying to replace that expensive option with Helen's nearby agricultural rights. Every finished roof increased the pressure on his timeline. Every conditional buyer increased the cost of delay, and every week made Helen's signature more valuable to him. She opened the irrigation control box beside the shed. This is a wet year's schedule. Then she showed him another sheet. This is from one of our driest summers. The difference was obvious. What you call excess water in one year becomes necessary water in another. I can compensate you for that. You can compensate me for selling it. Same thing, no. If I transfer a permanent right, 20 years from now, I can't irrigate a field with the money you paid me today. Caleb looked uphill. You understand how much I already have invested? I do. Roads, 14 houses, contractors, buyers waiting. And you knew the utility extension existed before you built them. Silence. That was the answer. Caleb handed her the revised offer. This time, Helen took it. The number was nearly twice the first, not because the water itself had suddenly become twice as valuable, but because Caleb's timetable had. Helen looked from the offer to the 14 houses. Caleb hadn't built without a water solution. He had built while betting that Helen would eventually become the cheaper one. Helen didn't reject Caleb's second offer immediately. The number was too large to dismiss without thinking, so she did something Caleb apparently hadn't expected. She calculated what selling would actually cost her, not in dollars but in acres. Helen spent the next morning with Laura Bennett and an agricultural water consultant, comparing the proposed transfer against the farm's driest years. They started with the upper fields. If you lose this amount permanently, the consultant said, you could probably maintain your current acreage in a good year. And a dry one? You'd have choices to make. What kind? He pointed to the map. Reduce irrigation here, possibly leave part of this field unplanted. Shift crops, reduce pasture demand. Helen followed his finger across land her family had worked for decades. And if there were 2 dry years in a row, your flexibility gets smaller. There was no dramatic prediction that the farm would die. The truth was more believable and more troubling. Selling the water would slowly remove Helen's margin for surviving bad years. That afternoon, she drove across the property alone. She stopped beside the lower pasture, then the equipment shed, then the oldest irrigated field on the farm. Caleb's money could improve all of them. She could replace the aging tractor, repair the barn roof, and clear the remaining farm debt. For a moment, Helen understood exactly why Caleb believed she would eventually say yes. Then she imagined owning a new tractor beside a field she no longer had enough water to irrigate. The offer suddenly looked less generous. Caleb called before dinner. Have you looked at the new number? Yes and no. A long silence followed. You can't be serious. I am. Helen, that's more than some farms around here sell for. Then buy one of those farms. I don't need another farm. You need its water. Caleb exhaled sharply. You're keeping rights you don't fully use. In some years. That's exactly my point. No, that's exactly mine. Helen walked to the kitchen window. Above her fields, construction lights glowed around the 14 luxury homes. You see unused water, she said. I see drought insurance. It's not insurance. It keeps this place operating when conditions get bad. Call it whatever you want. Caleb's voice became quieter. What if I increase it again? Helen closed her eyes. You're still trying to solve the wrong problem with money. Everyone has a number. Maybe, but your number assumes I'm ready to stop needing what you're buying. Caleb didn't respond. Helen continued. If I sell you those rights, your houses get more secure and my farm gets less secure. You're exaggerating. I checked. That ended the argument. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Caleb said something different. Not another offer, not another explanation, but a warning. I have too much invested in those homes for this to end with you simply saying no. Helen looked up at the illuminated hillside. Caleb had finally stopped pretending this was an ordinary sale. He had built 14 luxury homes around water he didn't own, and now money had failed to make the owner give it up. Caleb's third offer arrived the following Monday. He didn't bring it himself. A courier delivered the envelope to Helen's farmhouse shortly before noon. Helen opened it at the kitchen table, then stared at the number. Caleb had increased his offer again. This time, it was enough to erase every remaining farm debt, replace aging equipment, renovate the house, and leave Helen with more money than she had ever expected to have. For the first time, saying no wasn't easy. That evening, Helen walked the farm alone. She passed the old barn that needed a new roof, the tractor she'd repaired twice that year, and the irrigation gates she still opened by hand. Caleb's money could fix all of it, or Helen could sell the farm entirely. She could take the money, move somewhere smaller, and never worry about drought, equipment repairs, or another 5 in the morning irrigation schedule. For a few minutes, she allowed herself to imagine it. Then she reached the upper field. Water moved quietly through the irrigation ditch. Helen crouched beside it. That was when she understood what bothered her about Caleb's offer. He wasn't offering enough money to make the farm stronger. He was offering enough money to make leaving it easier. Caleb arrived the next afternoon. Did you get it? I did. That's a serious number. I know. He studied her face. Then we're finally talking. Helen handed him the unsigned agreement. No. Caleb didn't take it. You can't tell me you didn't consider that. I considered it all night. And you're still saying no. Yes, why? Helen looked toward the hillside. Because your offer makes perfect sense if I don't intend to keep farming. Caleb frowned. I don't follow. You're paying enough for me to leave. She pointed toward her fields. I'm asking what happens if I want to stay. Caleb finally took the papers. You could modernize. With less water. Change crops. Because I'd have less water. Reduce acreage. Helen nodded. Exactly. He stopped. Every solution Caleb offered required Helen's farm to become smaller so his development could become viable. That was the trade he had avoided saying aloud. I can't keep increasing this forever, he said. I never asked you to. 14 houses are sitting up there. I didn't build them. I have buyers waiting. I didn't promise them my water. Caleb's jaw tightened. He walked toward his truck, then turned back. There are other ways to solve this. I hope there are. You may not like all of them. Helen held his gaze. If you have a legal way to secure water without my rights, use it. Caleb climbed into the truck without answering. For weeks, he'd treated Helen's refusal as a negotiating position. Now he finally understood it wasn't. The next morning, two unfamiliar vehicles drove slowly along the road between Helen's farm and the development. One belonged to an engineering firm. The other carried the logo of a regional water utility. Helen watched them from the barn. Caleb had stopped asking what price would make her surrender her water. He had started looking for another way to supply 14 homes without it. For the next 2 weeks, Caleb stopped trying to buy Helen's water. Instead, he started spending money to prove he could live without it. Survey crews worked along the county road. Engineers marked the proposed utility route. A drilling contractor tested another possible source farther east, and representatives from the regional water utility visited the development twice. Helen watched from her farm. She didn't interfere. If Caleb could secure a permanent supply without her water rights, that was exactly what she wanted. The problem was that every alternative cost more than the deal Caleb had expected to make with her. The well option weakened first. Testing didn't provide enough confidence that it could reliably support 14 luxury homes year-round without additional work and approvals. The regional utility extension remained viable. Its feasibility had never been the central mystery. The engineers knew where the main was, how the route could reach the hillside, and what additional pressure and connection work would likely be required. The difficult questions were cost and time. Who would pay for the extension? How quickly final drawings could be approved? When road work could begin? And whether the completed line would be ready before Caleb's promised closing dates. Construction water used while houses were being built did not answer those questions because temporary job site access was not the same as an approved permanent domestic supply for occupied homes. The nearest suitable connection point was miles away. Caleb would have to pay for engineering, trenching, pipe, connection charges, road restoration, and the remaining approval process. Other transferable water rights existed too, but none were as close or convenient as Helen's. That was why Caleb had kept returning to her, not because her water was the development's only possible supply, but because it had been his cheapest hoped-for replacement for the utility extension. Laura called Helen that Friday. The development is approaching the point where Caleb has to finalize the permanent water arrangement. What happens if he doesn't? Construction can continue through whatever approvals he already has, but completed houses are a different matter. Helen listened. Before final occupancy and closings can proceed, the development still has to satisfy the applicable utility and water supply requirements. So the houses can be finished and still not be ready for buyers to move in? Exactly. That distinction made everything click. Caleb hadn't forgotten to plan for water. He had delayed committing to the expensive permanent option while betting he could acquire Helen's rights first. Now construction was catching up with that gamble. 3 days later, Helen saw the consequences. Not a moving truck, not a family being turned away, but an inspection vehicle entering the development shortly after 8 in the morning. Caleb's engineer arrived 10 minutes later. By afternoon, Caleb was at Helen's barn. The first occupancy approvals are being held until we complete the permanent supply documentation. Helen set down the tool in her hand. I'm sorry your schedule slipped. You could still fix it. No, I could make your cheaper option work. Caleb stared at her. Those houses are practically finished, and the utility extension is still available at a ridiculous cost. Helen nodded, but available. Caleb looked toward her irrigation ditch. The water I need is sitting right there. Helen shook her head. The water you want is right there. This time he didn't argue. Above them stood 14 expensive houses with roads, windows, landscaping, and buyers waiting under conditional agreements. The project wasn't doomed, and no family had lost a home, but Caleb's attempt to postpone the expensive water decision had finally reached its limit. He had 14 homes approaching completion, and before anyone could legally occupy them, Caleb had to stop betting on Helen's answer and secure the permanent water supply his own project required. The story changed before Helen realized anyone was telling it. She heard the first version at the farm supply store. Two men near the counter were talking about Caleb's development when one glanced at Helen. That's the farmer with the water dispute. Helen stopped. What water dispute? The man looked uncomfortable. The new houses up by your place. Heard somebody won't let them have water. Helen understood immediately. By the time she reached home, Laura had already called. You may start hearing that you're blocking the development. I just did. Don't react to it. I wasn't planning to. Good, because the distinction matters. You haven't taken water away from those homes. Helen looked toward Caleb's hillside. 14 roofs stood above the farm. No, she said. I refused to sell him mine. The difference sounded simple, but Caleb's problem made it easy to blur. Helen had never controlled the development's pipes. She hadn't shut a valve, challenged Caleb's right to build on his property, or promised him a single unit of her agricultural allocation. Caleb had asked her to permanently transfer part of an existing farm water right. She had said no. That was all. Helen began keeping copies of every letter and making notes after every conversation. She did not want anger, rumor, or an imprecise sentence to create a second dispute. Whenever someone asked, she repeated the same facts. The development had never owned her allocation, she had never agreed to transfer it, and Caleb retained an identified route to the regional system. Her answer might inconvenience his preferred budget, but it did not deprive a resident of an existing service. Still, the pressure increased. A prospective buyer stopped near Helen's driveway one afternoon. Are you the reason the houses can't get water? Helen could have sent him away. Instead, she answered carefully. Those houses don't depend on water I'm withholding from them. The man frowned. That's not what we were told. I can't speak for what you were told. So what's happening, mister? Warren asked to buy part of the water my farm uses. I declined. Why? Because my farm needs it. 2 days later, Caleb arrived furious. You're talking to my buyers now? One stopped at my driveway. What did you tell him? The truth. Caleb stepped from his truck. You understand what rumors can do to a development like this? Helen stared at him. Then stop letting people believe I took something from them. I never said that. Good, then we agree. Caleb rubbed a hand across his forehead. The utility extension is still being evaluated. If that falls apart, we're back where we started. No, Caleb. You're back where you started. His eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? My farm already has its water. The following morning, Laura forwarded Helen a written response from the relevant review process. The language was dry and technical, but the meaning was straightforward. Helen's agricultural water rights were not part of Caleb's development supply unless a lawful transfer occurred. Her refusal to transfer them did not make her responsible for supplying his 14 lots. Caleb still had options. He could secure another transferable supply, complete the utility extension, or pursue another approved alternative. What he couldn't do was turn the money he'd already spent into an obligation for Helen to sell. That afternoon, Caleb called. We need one final meeting. About another offer? No. His voice sounded different. The water plan. Helen looked toward the 14 luxury homes above her fields. For months, Caleb had negotiated as though enough money would eventually turn her no into yes. Now the houses were nearly ready, buyers were waiting, and the assumption beneath his entire strategy was about to be put on the table. This time, Caleb wasn't coming to ask what Helen's water was worth. He was coming to find out what happened if she never sold it. The final meeting took place in Caleb's development office. Helen arrived with Laura Bennett. Caleb was already there with his attorney, the project engineer, and the consultant responsible for the permanent water supply plan. A large site map covered the conference table. 14 lots, 14 nearly completed luxury homes, and internal water lines already installed beneath the development roads. A red line extended from the subdivision toward the distant regional utility main. That was the connection Caleb had spent months hoping he wouldn't have to build. The engineer began. The regional extension remains technically viable. The issue is that it still requires final engineering, utility approval, connection work, and construction. Helen looked at Caleb. And my water? The consultant answered. It isn't part of the development's approved permanent supply. Caleb said nothing. Laura leaned forward. So let's make this clear. Helen's refusal hasn't removed an existing water source from these homes. Correct, the consultant said. And the development has an alternative path. Yes. The utility extension. Yes. Caleb finally interrupted. At a cost that changes the economics of the project. Laura looked at him. That's different from having no solution. Caleb pushed his chair back. I have 14 houses approaching completion, conditional buyers waiting, and occupancy approvals that can't move forward until this is resolved. Helen understood his frustration, but none of those facts changed ownership of her water rights. Can the development require a transfer from Helen because construction has already advanced this far? Laura asked. Caleb's attorney answered this time. Not simply for that reason. Silence filled the room. Caleb looked directly at Helen. One last time. Name a number. There isn't one. You turned down enough money to change your life. I know. And you're willing to watch 14 houses sit there? Helen shook her head. No, I'm willing to let you finish the water system your own engineers already identified. It costs more than buying your allocation. Then that's your comparison to make. Caleb stared at the map. For months, he'd behaved as though Helen's refusal had created the problem. Now the timeline on the table showed something different. The utility route had been identified before construction reached this stage. Caleb had simply postponed committing to it while pursuing the cheaper transfer. He hadn't built 14 homes with no possible water source. He had built them while gambling that Helen would eventually sell, and he'd lost that gamble. The delay now had measurable consequences. Contractors had to be rescheduled, carrying costs continued, conditional closings had to be moved, and the remaining utility work became more urgent with every passing week. None of those expenses had been imposed by Helen. They came from Caleb's decision to postpone the infrastructure already identified in his own planning while he pursued a transfer that had never been promised. The distinction was uncomfortable, but it was the only accounting that matched the record. The engineer rotated the map toward Caleb. If you authorize the extension now, we can finalize the design and move it through the remaining process. How long? The engineer gave him an estimate. Caleb's jaw tightened. And the cost. The engineer slid a figure across the table. Caleb stared at it. Helen didn't ask to see the number. It wasn't her bill. That was the entire point. Her refusal hadn't taken water from 14 homes. It hadn't canceled Caleb's permits or destroyed his development. It had forced him to stop treating another person's property right as the discount built into his business plan. Finally, Caleb picked up a pen. Proceed with the extension. Helen looked at the 14 lots on the map. The project had its path forward, her farm still had its water, and the real mistake was finally impossible to hide. Caleb's 14 houses had never depended on Helen surrendering her rights. Only the profit margin he'd planned for did. Caleb chose the utility extension 4 days later. He did not choose it because he liked it, but because every other option had become worse. The proposed line would run from the regional system along the county road, climb toward the development, and connect to the infrastructure Caleb had already installed. It was technically possible, legally straightforward once approved, and it didn't require a single gallon of Helen's agricultural allocation. It was also expensive, very expensive. Caleb's final cost included more than pipe. The route required updated engineering, utility coordination, trenching beside the county road, pavement restoration, pressure testing, inspections, connection charges, and the expense of holding nearly completed houses while the work moved forward. Starting sooner would not have made the extension cheap, but it could have protected his schedule. Waiting had transformed an anticipated infrastructure cost into an urgent one. Helen learned of the decision when survey stakes appeared along the county road. A week later, Caleb stopped beside her farm. "We're doing the extension." Helen looked toward the stakes. "Good. That's all you have to say?" "What do you want me to say?" Caleb laughed bitterly. "Maybe congratulations on costing me a fortune." Helen's expression hardened. "I didn't choose where you built. No. I didn't design your water plan. No. And I didn't tell you my rights were for sale." Caleb looked away. Helen continued. "You had another water option from the beginning. Not one that made financial sense. It makes sense now. Because you wouldn't sell. Because it was always your project's cost." That stopped him. Over the following weeks, crews began trenching along the approved route. The work was larger than Helen expected. Sections of pavement had to be opened. Pipe arrived on flatbed trucks, and engineers inspected pressure requirements and connection points. Caleb paid utility fees, engineering costs, construction charges, and additional expenses created by the delay. Every dollar represented something he'd hoped to avoid by purchasing Helen's water. But the important difference was visible on the ground. None of the crews entered her farm, none touched her irrigation system, and none asked Helen to surrender anything. One afternoon, Laura stopped by. "Looks like he found his water." He always had another option. He had another possible option. Helen nodded. "Fair." She watched workers lower another section of pipe. "What happens to my rights now?" "Nothing." "Nothing?" "That's the point." Laura smiled. "You didn't transfer them. They remain with you under the existing arrangement." Helen looked toward her fields. After months of offers, meetings, consultants, and pressure, the outcome was almost strangely ordinary. Her farm kept what it already had. Caleb's development changed quickly once the utility work advanced. Inspection vehicles returned, contractors finished landscaping, and the temporary signs near several homes were replaced with closing notices. The 14 houses had never needed Helen personally. They needed a reliable, lawful water supply. Caleb had simply wanted Helen's because it appeared cheaper than creating his own solution. Late one evening, Helen saw water system crews working near the development entrance. Caleb stood beside them, reviewing plans. For months, he had looked downhill toward Helen's farm whenever his project needed water. Now the pipes ran in the opposite direction, toward infrastructure he had paid to secure himself. Caleb Warren had finally found water for his 14 luxury homes. It was the water he could have pursued from the beginning, the water he hadn't wanted to pay for. The first sign that Caleb's problem was finally ending wasn't a meeting or another offer, it was a utility truck. Helen saw it climbing the development road early one morning, followed by an inspection vehicle. By afternoon, workers were testing the new system. The regional extension had been connected. The 14 luxury homes finally had the permanent water supply Caleb should have secured before assuming Helen would sell hers. Helen watched from her upper field for a few minutes, then returned to work. There was nothing for her to celebrate. This was the outcome she'd wanted from the beginning. Caleb had his water and she still had hers. Over the following weeks, activity returned to the development. A moving truck stopped outside the first completed house. This time, it didn't leave empty. Furniture came out. 2 days later, another family arrived, then another. At night, lights began appearing in windows that had remained dark for weeks. Whatever delays Caleb had suffered, the project was moving again. 14 homes weren't going to sit abandoned above Helen's farm. No families had lost water because of her refusal. They simply received their water from infrastructure built to serve their own development. The utility would operate and maintain the new service under its own rules, while Helen remained responsible for using her agricultural allocation according to the terms attached to it. Two separate systems now served two separate purposes. That arrangement was less dramatic than the rumors, but it was more durable. Residents did not depend on a neighboring farmer's willingness to surrender a vital asset, and the farm did not have to become smaller to make the hillside development work. Caleb stopped at Helen's property one afternoon. She was repairing an irrigation gate when his truck pulled beside the field. "First 3 closings went through," he said. Helen stood. "Good. You actually mean that?" "Why wouldn't I?" Caleb looked toward his development. "I figured you'd enjoy watching me lose money. I wanted to keep my water, Caleb. I never needed you to fail." He seemed to consider that. "The extension cost more than your first 2 offers combined. Then I understand why you wanted my rights." He laughed, finally. I always understood why you wanted them. Helen wiped her hands on her jeans. You just didn't understand why I needed them. Caleb looked across the irrigated field. Selling would have been easier. For you. He smiled slightly. Yeah. For once, he didn't argue. Then his expression became serious. I shouldn't have counted on the transfer before you agreed. Helen nodded. No. I thought once you saw enough money, you'd sell. I know. Most people would. Maybe. Helen looked toward the water, moving through the ditch. But you weren't buying something I had sitting in a bank account. Caleb followed her gaze. He finally seemed to understand. Before leaving, he glanced toward the hillside. 14 houses, full utility service, buyers moving in. Sounds like you finished your project. Eventually. Caleb climbed into his truck. Helen returned to the irrigation gate. Above her, the luxury homes now had their own water supply. Below them, the same agricultural allocation Caleb had tried 3 times to purchase continued flowing through Helen's fields. Neither supply required the other to disappear. Caleb had completed his development. Helen had protected her farm, and after months of pressure, the solution proved something surprisingly simple. 14 new homes didn't need Helen to surrender her water. They needed their developer to secure water of their own. By early September, the hillside no longer looked like a construction site. Cars sat in driveways, landscaping had taken root, and porch lights came on each evening across the 14 luxury homes Caleb had spent months trying to finish. From Helen's farm below, the development was simply part of the landscape now. The houses had their water, Helen still had hers, and that was exactly how the dispute should have ended. One cool morning, Helen walked to the upper field before sunrise. The irrigation schedule called for water there first. She opened the control gate and watched the flow move into the ditch. Nothing about the moment looked important. There were no attorneys, engineers, or developers standing beside her with contracts, just water moving toward land that needed it. But Helen remembered how close she had come to accepting Caleb's third offer. The money would have changed her life. That part had been true. She could have replaced every aging piece of equipment on the farm, repaired the barn, paid every remaining debt, and stopped worrying about whether next year's harvest would cover the next expensive repair. But the check would have been spent, eventually, while the transfer would have remained. Later that morning, Helen carried a new binder into her office. Inside were copies of her water right records, irrigation history, correspondence with Laura Bennett, and every offer Caleb had made. She labeled the front, Farm Waterrights. Then she placed it beside the property records. Her family had understood the value of the water because they depended on it. Helen wanted whoever came after her to understand something else. A valuable farm asset didn't become surplus simply because someone offered enough money for it. That afternoon, Caleb's truck slowed near the boundary. He lowered the window. Everything running? Helen glanced toward the irrigation ditch. Like it always has. Caleb looked uphill at his development. So is mine. Then I guess we both got what we needed. He smiled. Would have been cheaper if you'd sold. Helen laughed. You really can't let that go. I'm a developer, and I'm a farmer. This time, both of them smiled. Caleb drove on. Near sunset, Helen stood beside the lower field. Above her, 14 expensive houses reflected the last orange light of the day. Somewhere beneath the road leading to them, Caleb's new utility line carried water uphill. Across Helen's farm, her own allocation continued moving through irrigation ditches that had served the property for decades. Development hadn't been stopped, and the farm hadn't been sacrificed. They had simply been forced to survive on resources each had a legal right to use. Helen watched the water reach the end of the field before closing the gate. Caleb Warren had offered enough money to change her life. What he never understood was that the water wasn't valuable because Helen could sell it. It was valuable because keeping it allowed her farm to remain a farm. If Helen's decision reminded you that the highest offer is not always the best bargain, share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have protected the farm's water or accepted Caleb's final offer? If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories about farmers, property rights, and the quiet decisions that shape a family's future. Thank you for watching, and remember, a resource is not truly valuable because someone wants to buy it, but because keeping it protects what you are determined to preserve.